So today we're talking about the legacy of John and Paul. Yes.
Yeah, their legacy and how they thought about their legacy and all of that.
And really the legacy of the Beatles as well.
Yeah.
So because I think those are three different things.
Mhm.
So we always start with trying to come up with a title. I think this one may be the hardest one to do. I'm going to let you start. I have some thoughts, but I'm going to let you start.
Okay. Well, I guess it's like trying to think about the iconic Beatles song. I mean, Day in the Life comes to mind. Where it's John's essentially, but Paul comes in there a little bit and adds some spice to it. And I think that's an all-time classic, and it's very deep and powerful and moving. So that's one possibility. Um, the combination of Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane is another strong legacy, I think. And probably their most popular song of all time is Hey Jude. I mean, I'd like to hear what you I'm just talking popularity, but so those would be some candidates.
Yeah, I think my issue with those choices, and I don't have a better one, is that I think our goal with coming up with these song titles in all of these episodes has been to find a title that kind of describes the subject. And I think where you're going is maybe these are the musical high watermarks of the collaboration between the two guys. Whereas if we're talking about politics, revolution was a title, or if we're talking about love, we were talking about I Want to Hold Your Hand versus whatever. So I don't think any of those songs, as much as I agree with you in terms of like their high watermarks of collaboration and stuff, it is a legacy title. But as we talked about, this one's a tough one. Like, for instance, I don't think it's applicable because in theory it's a Ringo song, even though it was written by John. But you could almost say I'm the greatest is like the legacy of the Beatles, right? Although it would be we're the greatest. Mm-hmm. So I think I don't have a good one for this, and it's going to be hard. I think I was going over some song titles in my head, and maybe some more will pop up, because I always find when we do these YouTube shows that things pop up. But like in a way, Let It Be is sort of one that I like for the Beatles legacy, because it's sort of like it's sort of an active statement. But the challenge for the three different ones is, I think with the Beatles there's unanimity of like this was the greatest recording group of all time, and it certainly has stood the test of time when you think about we're now 53 years after they broke up. And really, I mean, what are the arguments against Taylor Swift, the Rolling Stones? Like, it's hard to discount that 6-year period of Beatles recordings were or will ever be surpassed by any popular musical artist. So that's kind of the way you look at the Beatles legacy. And then Lennon's legacy ends, well, his life ends in 80. And so then now we've been living without this man for 43 years, and all of his recorded material, and for that matter, live material or presence in any capacity, stops in 1980, with the exception of like remaking through now artificial intelligence and whatever fragments of songs he left, and like the music that gets re-released, like the Ultimate John Lennon mix, or covers of songs that the late Jeff Beck and Johnny Depp did with Isolation. So the Lennon legacy is another thing. So you have the sort of legacy that ended in 70, the legacy that ended in 80, and then McCartney is still with us. So this one, I think, in a way, is the most abstract. And
are we moving on from songs?
No, I'm just trying to sort of articulate the challenge of coming up with a song for this one, but by
Yeah.
all means, I still think that's our objective. So
Well,
what
yeah,
are you
no, I,
thinking?
I agree with you. You made some good points, and there, yeah, I mean, as far as John, there's the legacy up till 70, the 80, and then it's the enduring legacy, and what we think will be the enduring legacy of both of the guys. But yeah, the thing with the song title that might capture the spirit of what we're looking at here, they didn't really write about the experience of being Beatles, or Beatlemania, say, which they could have done. I guess I never really thought about that, but those could have been quite interesting. I'm sure they wouldn't have done it on the nose, but in a indirect way, they could have alluded to that. And I'm scratching my head, like I can't really think of anything. I mean, I mentioned Glass Onion, where John's sort of taking a uh, just meaningless look at different songs they've done and stuff, and but I didn't really get any great meaning out of that. So yeah.
Well, I'm gonna give you a title in a minute. But I want to go back to what I said, because I just thought of one that I actually like a lot. But I want to go back to what I said, because in this particular episode, I think there are three answers. There's the Beatles answer, there's the John answer, and there's the Paul answer. So there's probably a John song somewhere that best describes his legacy, a Paul song that best describes his legacy, and a Beatles song. But since we're only picking one title when we actually post these things, we always endeavor to make it the Beatles because it includes both men. So I'm actually going to say that the title I'm the most comfortable with, or the one that I think is the most applicable here, is Magical Mystery Tour, because that's what the Beatles were. They were a magical mystery tour, and the magic and the mystery endorse. Like, it's still magical, it's still mysterious, and in a way, it's even more magical and mysterious now because it's survived and it's become part of, as we've talked about on other shows, younger generations. And so I don't think like, oh God, put your pens down, this is the ultimate like title, we're done. But I like it in that it's sort of the most descriptive of what I think the Beatles were and still are for us. But again, even if we accept that that's the title for this episode because it best encapsulates the Beatles, and I have a feeling you're going to have a rebuttal or a suggestion or whatever, it still doesn't answer the John Paul thing,
Yeah.
unless you want to globally look at it as it's all now a magical mystery tour.
Well, I think we ought to just answer the solo ones too, but I think that's a good call for Beatles, actually, and for the name of the episode, and kind of capturing that, like I said, the spirit of their legacy. And yeah, I think good call on that. So I think we're good with that. And then I think for John, it's interesting, for all he did in the Beatles, I think he's going to be remembered for Imagine as his greatest piece, or most enduring piece. Paul, I think, is going to be remembered more for, I was thinking of his, it would be Yesterday, Hey Jude, and Let It Be, those three. And if I had to say solo, it's either Maybe I'm Amazed or Band on the Run.
Right. But again, I want to be clear. We're not sort of, I don't think anyway, trying to figure out what will they most be remembered for. We're trying to figure out the song title that most would encapsulate their legacy. And what I mean when I say that is, there is no chink in the Beatles' armor other than they broke up too soon. Like, there's very little. Maybe there's one song you don't like on one record or whatever, but the bottom line is, it was always magical, it was always mysterious. With Lennon, I actually do like Imagine as a legacy title, because I think that, John Lennon's music and lyrics, whether it was Watching the Wheels, which was sort of his last message to us before he was unfortunately assassinated, or whether it was God, which was his sort of cynical, I don't believe in anything anymore except Yoko message at the end of 1970, or it was any Beatles songs that you think could be applicable. Essentially, John Lennon's legacy, and it was about imagining a lot of different things. And I don't even love that song that much. It's been played too much. But I do actually think it kind of works as a descriptive title of his legacy. Because the other two I had in mind was God, but I think that's more of a period of time, and Watching the Wheels, which I think is more of a period of time. And the word imagine, I just think opens it up to a more timeless quality. Paul is the most complicated one, because not only are you and I probably going to disagree on what I think his legacy is and what you think his legacy is, but also the songs that you just mentioned, and I love them, are not descriptive of a legacy. The closest one to me in a way has been On the Run, because he's always kind of reinventing himself, but he's not a band anymore. So the Paul one I think is going to, I think the Beatles one, we sort of said, okay, fine. I'm curious where you are on the Lennon one. But if we're in agreement on Imagine, I think Paul's going to be the toughest one, because I think, and I'm going to let you speak in a minute, is that this is going to sound horrible, but when you die at a younger age, it helps your legacy. It mythologizes you, and it allows you to end your output in a way where you're less vulnerable to the longer. We've seen this with so many artists. You've talked about Neil Young, Todd Rundgren. The longer you're hanging around, the harder it is to sort of reach the peaks that you reached when you were at your peak. And, McCartney has done a lot of great things since 1980, but, that's 43 more years of having to be like really, really good.
Yeah.
So anyway, have at it, but that's kind of where my head's at.
And that's why Billy Joel's an interesting case, because as we know, he consciously decided to stop writing and recording back in the 90s somewhere, and it kind of puts a time capsule on his material, and he sort of saved himself from what might have been a slew of forgettable records. Not that I've listened to every Elton John album that's come out, but that's sort of the impression I get, is that they're not all as memorable as his earlier output. So yeah, that's definitely something Paul's had to contend with. I'm sure. I mean, stating the most obvious of obvious, of course, he would take that choice any day. But yeah, as far as I know what you're going for with the sort of capturing the message of their career, or the who they are as an artist, but I guess I'm not limiting myself to that, and I think it's also equally an interesting question of what are their songs that people are still going to hold on to 100 years from now, 500 years from now. What are the ones that are really baked into the zeitgeist of the culture? And let's face it, as we've talked about throughout the series, John overall, I think, is maybe a deeper thinker and more edgy, certainly. So, he's going to write something like Imagine. Now, Paul did have Let It Be, but that was a little bit abstract. And for pretty much the entirety of his solo career, he's he's not interested in those kind of statements. So yeah, I just to make a long story short, I like Band on the Run. I think that's a good point. He's always kept going, and he's still going now. He's what, 81 at the time of this recording, and apparently he's recording an album now. So, you know, it's fabulous.
Well, I don't like Band on the Run because of what I said before, that he's not a band. But I will say this, it strikes me that, and I agree with you if I'm reading you right, that I'm being too literal about the title. So I do want to talk a little bit. If we're calling this thing Magical Mystery Tour, we're done with that, right? We're done.
Yeah.
We figured out our title. I think it's interesting that you mentioned Billy Joel, because and Elton John. So I want to talk about three sort of different artists. So Billy Joel, to your point, stopped recording, but he's killing it at these Madison Square Garden shows and in London. And I've seen one of those shows, and they're fabulous. And one of the things that I respect about Billy Joel is the set list changes. Elton John's albums, to your point, no, there's no Goodbye Yellow Brick Roads or Tumbleweed Connections, but I actually have listened to Elton John's most recent records, and they're quite good. It's just, we're just not in a world where you do that anymore. And he just decided he's done touring. I just watched the other night, this last concert ever, apparently, at Dodger Stadium. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that I just saw the Dead and Company show at Fenway Park, and then just bought the live stream the other night, which was quote unquote their last show. We'll see if that's true. And if I was to give Dead and Company or the Grateful Dead a song for legacy, I'd probably pick Truckin', because they're still at it. I think with McCartney, I'm going to break him up into sort of different pieces, because he is a little bit Billy Joel, he is a little bit Elton John, he is a little bit Dead and Company. And what I mean by that is, there's Paul McCartney, the recording artist. There's Paul McCartney, the icon, cultural icon, and there's Paul McCartney, the live act. And I think all three of them, in a way, are different legacies that build into one. And I think, you know, if you talk about the legacy of their recorded music, I think there's very little doubt that any Beatles song, well, most Beatles songs, are going to be in the cultural fabric of this world for as long as we have the ability to listen to music. With McCartney, the recording artist, and he's not alone in this, to your point about Elton John and Billy Joel, some of his later work is never going to be memorable, but a lot of that has to do with, it's just hard to get songs to be memorable anymore. You know, like I was listening to The Bridge, which is Sting's most recent album, and I was thinking, if he recorded this album and put it out in the 80s, would this be a hit? Would that be a hit? Where now he could write Every Little Thing Is Magic and it wouldn't be a hit. So the world has changed. The music industry has changed. So Paul McCartney's legacy as a songwriter, I think is he's a little bit a victim of what I was saying before. He just had 43 more years of putting out music where some were really good and others weren't as good. And, you know, and by the way, in the short period of John Lennon's solo career, you could say some was really good and some wasn't so good. So as a singer-songwriter, or as a songwriter, McCartney, to me, his legacy will go down as arguably the best or one of the best to ever do it. And I don't think anybody can disagree with that. And the fact that every song he wrote wasn't Hey Jude, Maybe I'm Amazed, or Band on the Run shouldn't tarnish his legacy. He did write a lot of crap, I think, but you know, you're not going to hit a home run every time you go to the plate. Tom Brady lost games. You know what I mean? Like, it's just hard to be.
Nolan Ryan lost a lot of games too.
Exactly. It's just hard to Michael Jordan, you know, he was one of the few athletes that never lost a finals, but he, you know, like, in other words, it's just, you can't stay at that standard forever. And the longer you're at it, the harder it is. So I think that for McCartney, that's what I have to say about his recording art. As far as being a cultural icon, I always,
let me come in there before you go into that, please.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the length of his career is just such an interesting phenomenon to look at. And you know, there's others, like, you know, like Dylan, I guess, is he's kept going. I'd say Elton and Dylan and Paul. I'm sure there's others, but
Jagger.
well, but they haven't recorded new material for a long time. Like they, I think Dylan and Paul and Elton, they've kept putting out stuff. And I think part of it is, I think they'll admit it's hard to keep coming up with bright, new, shiny stuff. And you don't have that same spontaneity you had as a young person. I think the other thing that maybe we don't think about as much, but it becomes evident when you listen to them, is their voices have changed. And I think most of us would say for the worse, although we can kind of get used to it. But you can go back to the last Billy Joel album and his voice still sounds very good, and Paul in the early 90s was sounding very good too, or it's still pretty good. But it's deteriorated, and he's still trying to write these pop songs that could be sung by a 30-year-old, and I'm not sure it works so well, and somebody was saying that I was listening to, that's his choice, like he could have made a transition to writing for other people and still been the songwriter, but let someone else perform it who could maybe do it better. But
This is why I like doing this, because every time you say something, it makes me think of something. I'm going to rip McCartney in a second, but I want to start by saying something really great about him. He's one of also, and I think he doesn't get enough credit for this, he's one of the greatest live performers. When you go see a Paul McCartney concert, even today, he gives you a long show. He gives you a set list that doesn't include obvious choices. Like he'll pull out a Letting Go off Venus and Mars. He'll even pull out a Temporary Secretary off McCartney too. He'll go deep, and I respect that. Now, he does note for note play the same set song every night on a tour, the opposite of, let's say, the Dead or Billy Joel, but he brings it. And I think that that's part of his legacy, that he's been putting on great shows for large audiences for a very long time. He has a great band. He finally found a band he liked, and he stayed with them for years and years and years, and they're great. Now I'm going to sort of not rip him, but sort of say a legacy that I personally would rather have, and that I think John Lennon would have been more like if he stayed alive. And you could argue that I'm wrong, because we'll never know. And that is the guy you mentioned, which is Dylan. So Dylan's voice has changed, but in a way he's made it work for him. He's written songs that sort of take advantage of how his voice has aged. And I would argue that his last album was Rough and Rowdy Ways, is one of his best at 81 years old. And some of the stuff he's written before that is extremely strong. And he tours relentlessly. I saw him on this tour. And while he reworks his songs in a way that make them less accessible, which is the opposite of McCartney, in a way he's doing something more interesting musically. And he doesn't need to be on talk shows or TikTok or Instagram. He's just sort of doing his thing. And I believe that if Lennon was around, maybe Lennon would be more like that. But again, we'll never know. My point is, there's a last point I'm going to make. The legacy of Paul McCartney is he was and is one of the greatest musical figures of all time, as a writer, as a performer. And I'm not saying this as a criticism per se, even though I don't really love this part of him. He's a give the people what they want kind of a guy, and John wasn't. And that to me in a way is their legacy. And it's apples and oranges, because we don't know how John would have evolved from 1980 to 2023. But I would say that the Paul McCartney of 1980, in terms of his purpose, in terms of his message, is pretty similar to the Paul McCartney of 2023. He's still kind of the same dude, he's putting out music often. He's performing that music. He's interested in getting that music listened to. I wonder, John Lennon went through so many personality changes because of drugs and Yoko and whatever. It's hard to know what he would be like in 2023, but that's, because it's interesting because we only can compare Paul really to some of the people you brought up: Paul Simon, Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
Bruce Springsteen, Mick Jagger, Pete Townsend.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think just John loved publicity. So he loved doing publicity. So that's where I think he would be different than Dylan.
you're probably right.
He loved to gab and,
You're probably right.
talk shit. And yeah. And, it's a matter of taste in some sense where I get a little frustrated with Dylan is he doesn't write melodies hardly anymore. And I'm not a huge Dylan expert, but from what I understand, he just straight up lifts a lot of this stuff from folk songs and just puts new lyrics on it and won't give guys credit either, whatever. But he's definitely, I mean, to say the obvious again, he's an incredible lyricist. He's just incredible way with words, and he is a great singer in his own sort of Leonard Cohen, Tom Waits kind of way. I give him that. But that's, apparently he said the one guy he looks up to is Paul McCartney, and I think what he what he loves about him is the melody side of it, which comes so naturally to Paul. And where I would agree with you, although you didn't say it explicitly, but I think you agree that, I wish Paul over his career would have worked harder on the words. Okay. Now I like some of his throwaways, of course. Yeah, it's just fun, dash it off. But some of it, he didn't do as well as he could have. And I think John obviously would have helped him with that. But he just didn't have the discipline. So I got to knock him on some of his lyrics, if not a lot of his latter day lyrics. But last thing is that I'll say for this point, what I most give him credit for is his willing to risk and his daring artistic nature. Whether it's the classical pieces that he's done. And again, I'm not a classical music expert, but I have listened to them all. And whether they're considered classics or not, I think it's certainly, quite bold of him to jump into that. And I also appreciate that he didn't overthink things so much that he's he won't release stuff that he creates. He puts whatever he puts into it and he says, I'm going to release it. I appreciate that about him.
Yeah, we're going to disagree on this point. I think he's very risk averse. I will say that, for instance, I really enjoy The Fireman, which in a weird way, he almost doesn't want anybody to know about. Like, that's what's weird about him. But I want to give credit where credit is due on that. But I think,
have you checked out any of the classical?
No, I'm not interested, because to me, like he's not, I'm not like against it. Like if somebody put it on, I wouldn't be like, turn that off. I'm just not curious enough.
That's impressive to go from a pop artist to writing a 90-minute, integrated classical piece.
I Yes, it is. But just because it's impressive doesn't mean I'm going to enjoy listening to it.
We
But
haven't given it a chance. Maybe you would. Maybe you
yeah,
love it.
maybe I would. Maybe I would. But well, actually, I heard a couple tracks because it's on that singles thing, right? So I heard a couple tracks, and I didn't have a strong opinion one way or the other. But it's interesting when you say listen to it or whatever, and you're not wrong. But one of the reasons I'm less inclined to listen to Paul McCartney is my counterpoint to what you said, which is I think, and Prince was guilty of this, I think he's a horrible editor in terms of putting stuff out. I think that part of your job as an artist, Neil Young is a real great example of this. Part of your job as an artist is to say, you know what, this isn't really something this is going to be filler. This is not going to be something that I think I want to release. So in other words, and maybe this is
what part of that? Because he's put out a ton of crap.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I love Neil Young. So it's like I have to listen to so much crap now to find that one song where I'm like, oh, wow, this is really good. So to the point where I don't even think Neil Young knows anymore what he thinks, what is good and what is not good, which is a little scary, So in other words, I want harvest. And if you need to throw out 15 songs in a recording session to get me those 10 songs on harvest, that's what I want from you as an artist. If I go to see a movie, and I know it's a little bit different, if I go to see a movie, I don't want to see a 3-hour movie that could have been a 2-hour movie.
Yeah, let me interject here with some history, which maybe but I just reminded myself reading something recently when they did Tug of War, when Paul did Tug of War with George Martin, he played him, I think, 14 tracks, something like that. And George Martin went to the record company and he said, yeah, Paul has 14 tracks. And the record company says, yeah, but how many does he really have? And George Martin's like, well, 4. and George could say to Paul, we're going to take these 4, good. These other ones, we're going to get rid of a lot of them. A few of them we can work on, but you better start writing more because we need better songs. And then I know the album you like, Chaos and Creation from the 2000s with Nigel Godrich, same thing. He came in, I think he was even, I remember Nigel said Paul came in saying, I want to have some Indian influence on this. And Nigel's like, no. And Paul's like, why not? Because that's not what you do. No, we're not doing that. And Nigel would say to him, get to work, man, because we're not taking, low quality on this album. But to your point, most of the time he doesn't want that kind of editor.
And so when you say, would you listen to the oratorio, a little of it is no, I won't, because Paul McCartney can do some real self-indulgent crap. And if he doesn't have a George Martin or a Nigel Godrich, I'm not going to be as interested. Now, having said that, pretty much any artist I love, if they did a classical record, and I like classical music, but if they did a classical record, I'd probably be like, yeah, I don't really want to listen to this. Did
you listen to Roger Waters' opera?
No, and I wouldn't. You know what I mean?
I think it's very good.
So
you're missing out on the Roger Waters French opera, man.
I'm not a real big Roger Waters guy these days.
Yeah,
but I did tell you, and I know I'm getting off the topic, that if you haven't listened to Dark Side of the Moon's new release through Dolby Atmos, it's great. Well, anyway, I think we're pretty much done with this one. I think that this one was the hardest one because a legacy continues to change. And, I will point to that concert that happened in California a few years ago, where they had the Who and they had the Rolling Stones and they had Paul McCartney, and Paul made some joke about it. It's self-deprecating joke about their ages and whatever. But I think when you look back in 2023 in the history of recorded music, and specifically those that are still with us. No matter what you want to say about Bob Dylan or the Rolling Stones or Paul McCartney, they're going to be on the Mount Rushmore of the deal. And the Beatles are always going to be on the Mount Rushmore of the deal. And as part of that, so is John Lennon, because even though everybody respects George Harrison and Ringo Starr, John and Paul are always going to have the bigger statue, so to speak. So the reason I've enjoyed doing this series with you, and the reason I want to continue to explore this, is because it is a magical mystery tour through these, works. And I think one of the things that makes this more interesting as we get older is looking at their flaws, because when you look at their flaws or their missteps, or you have the luxury of revisionist history, it makes things like Band on the Run or Plastic Ono Band or Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, it makes them so much greater, because you realize how unique and magical and mysterious these particular songs and records were. And, I guess my last statement on this is the greatest thing about the Beatles was the way the four guys not only played music together, but made magic in terms of the way they just culturally were part of the world. Even the movies, some of them are great. They're really great. You go and watch Hard Day's Night and Help, they're great. And then watching the Get Back documentary and really seeing how these guys interacted, like it's one of those things that no matter who you respect as an artist, they're always like, oh yeah, the Beatles. Yeah. It's like, yeah,
definitely. I know we want to go, but I think we should say something about how Paul's tried to manage his legacy through the years, and it seems to be even ramping up now. He comes out with this giant book about his lyrics.
Podcast, I just emailed you. He's doing.
He's going to do a podcast based on his lyrics. He's going to
the Rick Rubin
interview. There's going to be a new documentary about Wings coming out, I can't even think of everything else. But over the years, people have gotten a little bit annoyed. Like he seems to, he wants to change the Lennon McCartney to McCartney Lennon on some of the songs. I don't know if you remember.
Yeah.
He wants to always say, I was the first avant-garde guy. John got that from me. I introduced him to Yoko, and I don't know. I guess it's understandable, but what can you say? I just think we should just mention that, and that's the thing. John isn't here to speak up for himself anymore. But I think we can safely say they were both tremendous artists, certainly, and human beings in certain ways. And their legacy is musical brilliance. The cultural that you talked about, you just look at from 1960 to 1970 and just look at their pictures, or listen to their music, or both, and you see the evolution of Western culture. So that's something incredible. And then, as I think we've touched on in other episodes, they seem to have a positive message for the world, and they're basically saying it's going to be okay. Take the risk and be open and love and go for your dreams. And so it's a beautiful legacy.
Well, I don't want to end on a snarky note, I think, but I have to address it. I totally am turned off by all of these McCartney efforts to manipulate his legacy, and I would turn to him and just snarkily say, "Hey, Paul, let it be. You know what I mean? Like, just let it be." And I really think it's unfortunate, even though some of the things I do enjoy. I I agree with you about all of the greatness. You know, I do sort of like the fact that balanced with the sort of love and utopian stuff was the cynicism that Lennon brought, because I think it's kind of saccharine to just be love, love, love and live your dreams and all that, because we don't live in a world that allows us to always do that. There's a lot of bad actors in the world, and the human race is a continuing challenge. And I think it's a little bit more interesting with art to have kind of some darkness. But that's again why I love both of these guys, and why I agree with you that the music is magical. And it's been a big part of our friendship, which, you know, I think is true with a lot of people. It's been a big part of your relationship with your kids, my relationship with mine. And I think all in all, the reason we're spending so much time talking about this is because it's important to us, and it's helped shape who we are. And when we're talking about them in a frustrating way, it's because we hold them on such a high pedestal. And when we're talking about them in a reverential way, it's because they've earned this. And that as we've gotten older, we've only gotten more appreciative of the better stuff that they've given us. And, you know, unfortunately, we won't have any new music from John Lennon, but every single time Paul McCartney releases an album, I'm a little bit like, maybe I'm going to like this one. Maybe I'm going to like it.
Yeah. Real quick, rapid fire. Your favorite John Beatles song? Go.
Oh, I can't rapid fire that answer. I just
It's
can't.
just off the top of your head.
Well, Day in the Life is in my head, but I think it's because you said it. But, you know, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is up there, and oh my God, I just.
All right. Let's leave it at those. All right. So mine is Dear Prudence. I just
Okay.
absolutely love that song, start to finish. Favorite Paul Beatles song?
Again, just really hard. Like, is Day Tripper a John song or a Paul song?
I don't even know on that one.
That's what I'm saying. Like, it's just,
yeah, I know. Yeah,
it's hard. I don't, you know, I just don't know. I don't have like a favorite. I just don't.
All right, I'm gonna say Yesterday for that. Favorite John solo song?
Again, very difficult. I'm gonna say God, but
All right, I like Working Class Hero. And do you have a favorite Paul solo song? Like you know, just the one. If you had to go listen to Paul McCartney now, or you know, tomorrow.
I have a lot, because if I'm picking my favorite Paul McCartney rocker, I'm picking Junior's Farm. If I'm picking my favorite Paul McCartney song that nobody knows, I'm picking Warm and Beautiful. If I'm, you know, I just like, you know, if I'm picking maybe my most fun song, it's Uncle Albert. Like I just like,
I know it's impossible.
It's impossible.
I'm gonna go with Daytime, Nighttime Suffering. That's
love that song.
Yeah, I love it.
Love that song.
So it's a tremendous.
All right,
legacy.
man.
It's been fun talking about it.
Absolutely. Let's figure out what the next sort of series is for this.
All right, sounds good. All right, peace. See ya.